So part 4, the hospital visit. Um, had the baby, the first night. So they moved us to a different room after we had the baby, and our midwives moved all of our stuff for us. I thought that was really sweet. But after we had the baby, we're in this hospital room, and we discover through the night that, like, the thermostat didn't work. It was stuck on 80 degrees and the room wouldn't cool. The buttons on my bed didn't work. So the bed could only be adjusted from the outside of the bed, which really sucked. The door to the front of the room wouldn't stay closed, so it was constantly popping open to the hallway. And then nurses would come in and like just open the curtain, and I'm like laying there overheating like a starfish with a catheter sticking out of me for anyone in the hallway to view. And I felt so exposed. I felt like any dignity I had hoped to retain through this experience was out the door. And, the guy bringing the food, this big burly guy would come in, 3 or 4 times a day, because they come in twice per meal. So they come in to take your order, then they come in to bring the food, then they come in like an hour later to pick up the tray, then they come in to take your order. So they're coming in all throughout the day, and I'm like completely exposed, and this guy is coming in, the food guy, who's not a nurse, not a doctor, and he's like walking into a full view of my vagina with a catheter sticking out. And, I'm like overheating, it's 80 degrees, laid out, no covers, and the door's popping open half the time. And he's like, "Oh, congratulations on your baby. Thanks, appreciate, I'll take the chicken fingers, I'll take a burger." So that was an experience. And I mean, what can you do but laugh? And then the second night we had like a night nurse that just could not give a shit. And, by this point, the baby is getting really hot. She's not really wanting to latch. Like, we're struggling. We're exhausted. We haven't slept for 5 days by this point. And the nurse, I was saying to her, "Hey, I'm noticing like the baby is hungry. I know what a baby looks like when it's hungry. She's queuing. She wants to eat. Her legs are like popping up in the air. She's arching her back. She's screaming. Her face is turning red. I think she has gas. And I think that's why she's not latching. I think that's why she's not eating. Can you give us any tips for what we can do to help her pass this gas, or to burp or something, so that I can get her latched? I haven't, been around a baby in like 6 years, so I don't remember all the tricks. Can you help us out?" And the night nurse is like, "That's just normal." No, it's not normal. Like, there's got to be something. So we're like on YouTube, 5 days sleep deprived, trying to figure out, what do you do for a baby with gas? What I think was happening was, I think she did have gas, but I also think that we were all overheated. I think I was getting frustrated and anxious, and I think that was also affecting the baby. Brandon and I got into several difficult, I wouldn't call them arguments, but we were just very testy with one another. And I don't even remember what they were about. I mean, it was probably about stuff like, "Can you grab this?" Or can you grab me the baby? Cause I'm like 12 hours past the C-section, 24 hours past the C-section. So very, very sore. I still have the catheter in, and can't go to the bathroom on my own. I think at this point I had just begun to get up, and the big task was, can I walk across the room and back? So I'm doing that kind of stuff. And we're both just miserable because we're so hot. and the room was really dark because there was one small window like in the corner, but there just wasn't a lot of light. Well, and by this point it was nighttime, but it was just very challenging, and we're exhausted. So the night nurse was not helpful at all. That night, I believe they did the array of tests that they do 24 hours after the birth for the baby, where they like test the hearing, they test reflexes, and we wanted all of those. Like, even if we had been at home, I said I wanted to do all of those. They did the bilirubin test, and her levels came back, and they weren't good. And they told me, hey, we think that, and this is becoming morning, and they're like, hey, we think you need to like release the baby to go sit under the bilirubin lights, because bilirubin basically, I guess it builds up in their system, and they pass it through digestion and pooping and getting the meconium out, and so you've got to be feeding the baby. They've got to be having wet diapers, which she was. And then, they have found that vitamin D, which is why they put them under these lights, also helps to get it out of their system. So they're like, she has too much of this bilirubin in her system. She's got to sit under these lights. And I'm like, do not take my baby from me. Like, you're not going to take my baby. I've said yes to every intervention, but you are not taking this baby. And they finally talked me into it because they said, all right, look, we're going to take her to, this pediatric area. Y'all can come visit anytime you want. You can stay as long as you want. She's never going to be inaccessible, yada, yada. So I'm like, okay. And they said something about 3 hours. So I was like, all right, fine. You can take the baby for 3 hours. And then they're like, well, no, like, we're taking her for 3 hours at a time, and then we're bringing her back so that you can breastfeed her. And we're going to keep her for like 24 hours, and she'll come back every 3 hours. And that's whenever I was like, I don't know about this. Like, so we talked about it, because they were kind of implying, if you don't get these levels down, you guys might leave the hospital at different times. We might have to keep your baby longer. And so I'm like, fine, she's just sitting under a light. It was extremely disappointing to me, though, because I wanted the skin to skin. That helps your breast milk come in. It helps you bond with the baby. It helps to regulate their internal systems. And I'm kind of sitting here like, well, can't we just open the window and like set her out in the sunlight? And, it didn't sound like that was really the option. So they take her, they keep her under the lights. Brandon is going, every so often to check on her. They're bringing her to me every 3 hours. Our morning nurse that day was incredible. She comes in, I'm like having a complete breakdown. And I say to her, hey, I'm having a breakdown. Like, I am an emotional wreck. They're taking the baby. She's not going to be with me all day. I'm burning up. My bed doesn't work. The door keeps opening. The food guy's coming in, like all of these things. And the nurse is like, and I'm like, and we've been fighting all night. And I'm watching Brandon sleep, and I'm not getting any sleep. And that's frustrating. And the nurse is like, she's incredible. She's like, hey, you guys are going to work together for the rest of your stay here, and we're going to get you guys on a schedule and on a routine. And, that lights me up. And she's like, all these problems about the room, that would make me upset too. This is very uncomfortable. We're getting you a new room. And we're going to take care of your baby. We're going to love her. Like, this is all going to be okay. You're going to get your time with your baby, yada, yada. And so I'm like, okay, I trust you. I will trust you. So she gets us a new room, and everything changed. And because they had the baby for these, 3-hour stretches, by that point, I'm like, I'm going to get a shower. And I got a shower. I took a nap, and that made a huge difference to me, mentally. Because by that point, going on 5.5 days of not sleeping, I was getting to the point where I could not fall asleep. And that was becoming a huge problem, because when I would try to rest, I was so wired I couldn't sleep. So that was becoming an increasing concern. The catheter was still in. They had tried taking it out. I couldn't pee on my own. I was getting very uncomfortable. They put it back in, and then once we got into our new room, a few hours later, they took it out, and I was able to start going to the bathroom finally on my own. But I had to do like a series of ice packs and get the swelling down and all this. It gave Brandon a chance to rest, and then they come back like, I guess, late afternoon, and they had retested her for the bilirubin rates, and they were like, hey, we're sorry. We made a mistake, and we inputted the information the first time that we did the test incorrectly. She was never at an unhealthy range, but now she's like right at the threshold, so we want to start supplementing formula. And we want to get all this bilirubin out of her system so that you guys can go home together. And I'm like, it was such a mix of emotions, because part of me was like, you made a mistake and kept my baby from me for like the last 9 hours. Not cool. And, by this point, I'm like pumping with the hospital pump to try to get my milk to come in and to try to get the colostrum, because when they would bring her, she's only getting like, maybe a teaspoon of colostrum, which is all they can really take in anyway, because a newborn's stomach is like the size of a blueberry. And I'm not kidding. It's very small. And then it grows day by day. And by, I want to say, the 3rd or 4th week of life, it's only like the size of an egg. So they don't have very big stomachs. And that's why when you are getting drops of colostrum out, that's enough for your baby. It's highly nutritious. It's very, I guess it's exactly what they need. And so you don't have to fear if you allow that natural process, and your milk won't come in for like 4 or 5 days. So it's okay for them, and they're feeding often. So it's not the end of the world if, they're not getting large quantities of milk, and you really don't want them to, because you don't want their stomach to be stretched too soon. So because I had said yes to everything up until this point, and because they were scaring me thinking they're going to keep my baby longer than me, and I'm already peeing on my own, like they're talking about discharging me within the next 24 hours. She's not in the clear yet. Can they actually keep my baby against my will? And as it turns out, they can, because she is her own person. So legally, they can do a different discharge date, even if you as the parent don't want it. So I was like, no, I need to either stay in the hospital as long as possible, or I need to get this baby out of the hospital as quick as possible. So I said, okay. They said Brandon could feed her the formula. So he's now going every so often to feed her the formula. They're bringing her to me to continue to try to latch. And every time she would come to me, she got less and less motivated to try to latch. She was getting frustrated. She didn't want to try. And it was because she was getting like 2 ounces of formula on her own super easily. And that was frustrating, and that was impacting my milk supply. So, if it's supply and demand. If a baby is not requiring the milk or the colostrum, you're not going to produce as much. So that was very, very frustrating, and I'm not getting the benefit of skin to skin, which also causes a hormonal response to my body to tell it to make more milk. So I'm pumping as much as possible. They're like, hey, you've only got 30 minutes to figure out how to get your baby latched and fed. And she's not wanting to do it. And, the time and the pressure, it was just awful. We had great nurses the whole time, very empathetic. The food was amazing. So those are some of the positives. But I was stressed. And they're like, yeah, we're going to keep her all night. And we're going to retest and blah, blah, and Brandon will come and formula feed her. And I'm entering into my 6th day of not really sleeping. So I said, hey, I need a sleep aid. If we are going to have to be without our baby for another day, I want the benefit of going home with a full night's rest. Like I at least want to be able to sleep for a few hours. So they give me like 3 milligrams of melatonin and I was out. I'm talking out of it. And I wake up in the middle of the night and I see the baby's in the room. And keep in mind, I have this melatonin, like I can barely function. I'm so tired. And I'm just like, the baby's in the room. Brandon is responsible for feeding the baby. Brandon is sleeping. They must have brought her back early. Her rates must be good. I'm not going to bother Brandon. Like I could hear her cueing, saying she's hungry. And I just thought, this is one of those moments. I'm just going to honor my husband, trust that he's got this. And I'm not going to worry about it. I'm just going to assume that he has it all under control. And then I wake up again 3 hours later. I hear her cueing, kind of like sucking on her fist and everything. I see Brandon sleeping and I'm like, he must have fed her. I bet it's time again. That's about, 3 hours. I bet he is going to get up any minute and feed that baby. So I go back to sleep. And, like I'm so tired, I can barely walk to the bathroom and back. So it's not like I was being lazy or anything like that. Like I am surviving. And then the nurse comes in another 2 or 3 hours later. And it's like 6 a.m. Brandon's waking up. The nurse is like, so how'd the feeding go? Did you feed the baby? And Brandon's like, no, I didn't feed the baby. And I broke down. Like I lost my mind. And I'm standing there just like sobbing with the nurse. And the nurse is like, what's wrong? Why are you crying? Why am I crying? I'm crying because my husband didn't feed the baby all night. The baby has to be fed in order to pass the bilirubin. We are being threatened with them withholding the baby if her bilirubin levels don't get better. And she's a newborn baby that just went like 7 hours without eating. And they're supposed to eat like every 2 hours at least. And so I'm just like, that's why I'm crying. Like, because he didn't feed the baby. He's not a responsible parent. Like, I'm thinking all of these things and so frustrated. And I just felt so alone and so betrayed. Oh, and I'm like trying to nurse her and they're like, hey, her bilirubin rates are great. You're fine. Like, you don't need to worry about it. Keep her on supplement. And I'm like, why would I keep her on supplement? The whole point of the supplement was to get the bilirubin rates down. They're down. I'm breastfeeding. Like, I'm not letting this be stolen from me. And after everything else I've been through, I am not giving up on my breastfeeding journey, especially while she's struggling to latch as a result of being on this damn supplement anyway. And so they're like, oh, well, it doesn't work that way. Once you start supplementing the baby, her stomach is stretched. You're going to have to continue supplementing the same quantity until you can produce enough to compensate for what she's getting in the supplement. And I'm like, because they're like, her stomach has already been stretched out. She's got to keep up the same volume. And, I'm still producing drops of colostrum and we're filling the tiniest little syringes with like just tiny amounts of this stuff. And I'm like, you didn't tell me that in advance. And that's something I didn't learn in advance. So, and I do not handle this kind of stuff well in the moment. So I'm having another breakdown. And I'm trying to feed her this supplement, and there's nothing more to feeding than trying to feed your baby the limited drops of colostrum, knowing that your milk is coming, not being able to generate it, feeding the baby this bottle of betrayal, synthetic formula, and knowing that that's the very thing that's keeping you from getting to where you want to go on your feeding journey with your baby. And so I'm just like sitting there so frustrated, and she quit eating after like maybe an ounce. So I didn't feed her the rest. And then she did it again a couple hours later, and I didn't feed her the rest. And so my thought was, okay, I'm just going to give her what she wants. I'm not going to force the amount that they want her to eat. I'm not going to make that happen. Like, I'm not going to keep jamming this bottle in her mouth until she gets that amount that they want her to get. I'm going to let her... Sorry. Oh, sorry. The baby sneezes the same way, by the way. I'm going to let her set the tone for how much she wants to eat. And maybe I can produce it faster because we're doing less quantities. And I didn't tell anyone. I just threw the bottle away after I was done. So that's how we did it. And, surely I'm making more colostrum. And they're like, hey, we're going to discharge you today at 12 around lunch. And I'm like, yes, get us out of here. We are ready to go home. And 12 o'clock rolls around. I'm like, hey, if things happen, if you get a birth or something, it's fine. We can wait a few hours. No worries. Well, then 2 p.m. rolls around, 3 p.m., 4 p.m. They fed us breakfast, lunch, and dinner. My pain medicine is wearing off. It's 5 p.m. by this point. And we have packed everything up and put it in the car, except for the baby and the car seat. And we're fully dressed. We both had showers, and we're like, where the heck are they? The pharmacy is closing. It's Saturday night. We're not going to be able to get any pain medicine after we leave here until Monday because we couldn't find a 24-hour pharmacy. Everything is closing up. And that morning we had this doctor come in. And that guy, man, he was a real piece of work. He comes in wanting to know our birth control plans. And I'm like, we're going to do what we did before. We're going to do the natural family planning, the charting. I'm not taking any birth control. I'm just going to look at my cervical mucus. I hate that word. But I'm just going to do that, kind of go off of my ovulation cycle. And then we're going to use condoms. And he's like, oh, I'm horrified for you. You're going to end up pregnant again. And I'm like, that's the goal. I'd love to end up pregnant again. And this plan, if you follow it and do it right, it's 95 to 98.5% effective. That's very high. So it's comparable with other birth control methods, combined with condoms, and that only increases the chances that you're not going to get pregnant. I think condoms are 99.8% effective. So that's pretty good odds of not getting pregnant until you want to. And I was telling him, we're going to wait a little extra time than we would have if we had had the birth of our dreams, because I want to make sure that my body heals well and that, I'm capable of carrying a baby and my uterus is able to stretch again and that the scar tissue has, healed to the point that it can, and yada, yada. Because I want a VBAC. I want another home birth. I am going to do all of this over again. And he's like, oh, that's a terrible idea. 1% of the people who try that have a horrible experience. And they end up, practically dead, or, getting a uterine rupture or going into preterm labor. You'll never be able to do that again. You'll have to come to the hospital. And so I'm on the verge of another breakdown because I'm like, do not tell me when I know so many people who have had VBACs and successful home births that I can't do it. There's no reason I can't do it. I've had a great experience, and I'm a healthy person, and I'm going to have this. And he's like, no, you're not. And then he's like, I suggest an IUD. You need to look into getting one immediately. And I'm like, well, I don't want an IUD because my sister had one and it went through her uterus and almost killed her. And he's like, oh, well, that's only 1% of the people who get these IUDs experience something like that. They're actually very safe. So Brandon is taking a nap. He pops up when this guy says this, and I'm like practically in tears. And he's like, so what's the difference in the 1% of the people who have a negative experience with a VBAC at home on their second home birth, and the difference between the 1% of the people who have a negative experience getting an IUD and it goes through their uterus and almost kills them? And the doctor was just like very upset by that question. And he did not like the fact that Brandon was like challenging the bias he held. And from that point on, he did not want to help us. So when it came time for our discharge, and I'm like, hey, I've been on narcotics up until this point in the day. They're like an hour worn off. I'm getting in pretty significant pain. Like my pain level is like a 6 by this point. I can barely walk. And he's talking about, well, just take ibuprofen whenever you get home. And I'm like, okay, in my mind, and keep in mind, I don't take medicine normally, so I don't know very much about it. And I'm like, so you've had me on narcotics up until this point. You're not going to send me home with anything, and you're telling me to go home and pop an ibuprofen? Is that really going to work? And he's like, yeah, it's just like whenever you are on your period and cramping, you pop an ibuprofen. And I was like, I don't. I take vitamins and supplements and herbs for that, and they work way better. And he's like, no, they don't. Science. And I'm like, yes, they do. Woman experience. Like, I've had 20 years of experience with this man. You think I know more than you do in my body? Like, I think I might know something you don't know, Mr. Never Had a Period. Don't tell me an ibuprofen works whenever I have lived it my whole life. And so I'm just like, okay, well, should I do what I would do if I'm on my period and take my herbs and stuff? He's like, oh no, an ibuprofen is way better. And so I'm like, no, like I need at least a day or two of the narcotics, I think, just to like get myself to that next level of healing. And he's like reluctantly, okay, I'll give you some. Writes a new script. Then we realize that our pharmacy is closed, so they have to transfer it. And he's like rolling his eyes and acting like it's a huge inconvenience. But I mean, they've waited till 6 p.m. to release us. So, what you gonna do? And then they finally get us out. That wait was just a long one. We get to the pharmacy and realize it's closed. We can't get a hold of anyone at the hospital to transfer the script. We can't find a 24-hour pharmacy. We go home and I end up taking ibuprofen, just like he said. And you know what? It worked. So he was right about that. I'm going to tell you that right now. And it did work. I'm taking like 4 of these every few hours. And I did that for a couple days, 3 or 4 days. And then I didn't need it anymore. So that went well. We get home and man, that was just like a rough next few days because we get home to an environment that is still set up for birth. And, we're 3 or 4 days into baby. And the idea was after I give birth, we're going to set up my cart and everything for feeding the baby and just kind of being in bed. And that was another thing that was just really challenging and difficult was, okay, now we're home. It's late. My pain meds have worn off. We aren't used to having a baby in our space. I'm used to having a baby in the hospital bed. I've kind of mastered over the last 3 days breastfeeding in that environment. So now in our environment, it's like, okay, how do I set up pillows to like position the baby right? Do I want to breastfeed in bed? Do I want to breastfeed in the rocking chair I have in the nursery? Like we need to figure out where we're going to set up our changing station. Are we going to go to the baby's room every time we want to change her diaper or have it, in our bedroom? So we're trying to set everything up. We're trying to let our dogs get to know the baby. And that was all just challenging. We're exhausted. It was rough for a couple days. But things got easier and easier. We started to figure out where everything was. My midwife came over at like 10 or 11 p.m. I want to say that actually, it was the second night that we were home. Maybe it was the first night. It was the first night that we were home. So she's over here at like 10 or 11 p.m. trying to help us with the breastfeeding. We're getting in touch with the lactation consultants. Like, it was just a lot at once. The learning curve. And I knew that was very common and I expected it, but it didn't mean it was any easier. But then by, 3 or 4 days in, things were getting a lot easier. By the 1 and 2 week mark, things felt pretty good. And then by the 3 week mark, things felt right. And by 3 weeks in, by that point, we had our system. She's sleeping at predictable times. And that made all the difference. So that's the birth story. I am going to make one more part where I am going to discuss the reasons I intend to have another birth at home and why I want to aim for another unmedicated birth.